When most people think of the Vietnam War, they picture American helicopters flying over dense jungle, soldiers in green fatigues, and grainy footage of anti-war protests. But the story of the Vietnam War didn't begin in the 60s. It began more than a century earlier. To understand how Vietnam became the center of one of the most divisive conflicts in modern history, we need to go back to 1858, when the seeds of revolution were first planted in the soil of colonization. In 1858, the French launched a naval assault on the Vietnamese port city of Da Nang. On paper, the mission was a response to the persecution of Catholic missionaries in Vietnam, but in reality, France was seeking to expand its colonial empire in Asia, just as Britain was consolidating India and the Dutch were exploiting Indonesia. The French moved quickly. By 1862, after several military victories, they forced Emperor Tu Duc to cede the southern region of Vietnam, Cochin China, through the Treaty of Saigon. Over the next few decades, French influence expanded. By 1887, Vietnam was fully colonized and incorporated into French Indochina, along with Laos and Cambodia. Colonialism brought roads, railways, and French-style education, but these benefits were uneven and served colonial control far more than local development. Vietnamese society was turned upside down. The colonial economy was built on exporting rubber, rice, coal, and tin, all for the benefit of France. Vietnamese peasants, who made up 90% of the population, bore the brunt of heavy taxation. French citizens and administrators held all major power and wealth. In the cities, French colonialists lived in grand villas and sipped wine in cafes. The colonial government enforced a rigid class system. French at the top, a small group of Vietnamese elites in the middle, and the vast majority, peasants, workers, and intellectuals at the bottom. French policy also aimed to reshape Vietnamese identity. Schools emphasized French history and language. The goal was to create a generation of Vietnamese who thought and acted like French citizens, but without granting them equal rights. From the very beginning, Vietnamese nationalists resisted French colonization. In the late 19th century, resistance movements like the Can Vuong called on loyalists to rise up and restore the emperor. These results were courageous but poorly organized, and they were crushed by French military power. By the early 20th century, a more modern, ideological-driven resistance was taking place. Educated Vietnamese who had traveled abroad were inspired by global movements, especially the fall of the Qing dynasty in China and the rise of the Japanese power after the Meiji Restoration. Secret societies, student groups, and political parties began to emerge, calling for independence and reform. One of the most significant developments was the rise of socialism and communism, which offered a radical new framework for overthrowing colonial power, not just in Vietnam but across the global South. No figure looms larger in Vietnam's modern history than Ho Chi Minh. Born Nguyen Sinh Cung in 1890, he came of age during the height of French oppression. In his 20s, he left Vietnam and spent years working and studying abroad, in France, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. In Paris, during World War I, Ho became involved in leftist politics. He tried unsuccessfully to lobby President Woodrow Wilson at the 1919 Versailles Peace Conference for Vietnamese self-determination. That rejection radicalized him. He concluded that Western democracies would never grant independence willingly, and that revolutionary struggle was the only path forward. He joined the French Communist Party in 1920 and later trained in Moscow. By the early 1930s, he had helped form the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, the ideological core of what would later become the Viet Minh, a broad nationalist front aimed at ending colonial rule. The 1930s were marked by growing unrest and brutal repression. The global Great Depression devastated Vietnam's economy. Peasants lost land, wages fell, and poverty deepened. Strikes, uprisings, and protests became much more common. In 1930, a failed uprising known as the Yen Bai Mutiny, led by the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, shocked the colonial authorities. In response, the French launched a crackdown. Mass arrests, execution, and the destruction of political networks. Still, the resistance did not die. Communist cells operated underground, especially in rural areas. Ho Chi Minh, who had been working in China and the Soviet Union, was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to return. In 1940, France itself was occupied by Nazi Germany, and its colonial government in Indochina became a puppet of the Axis powers. Shortly after, Imperial Japan invaded and took control of Vietnam, but curiously allowed French colonial officials to continue administering the region under Japanese oversight. This dual occupation plunged Vietnam into chaos. The Japanese stripped the country of rice and resources for their war effort. In 1945, a devastating famine killed over 1 million Vietnamese. This misery deepened hatred for both the French and the Japanese. In this period of crisis, the Viet Minh, now formally led by Ho Chi Minh, gained momentum. The organization united communists, nationalists, peasants, and intellectuals under a single cause: Vietnamese independence. The U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, even operated with the Viet Minh during the war, providing arms and intelligence to help them fight the Japanese. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh seized the opportunity. On September 2, 1945, in Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square, Ho declared Vietnam's independence, reading aloud a document that began with the words of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. But this independence was short-lived. The post-war world was reshaping. The Cold War was beginning. France, desperate to reclaim its colonial prestige, refused to recognize Ho's government. In 1946, French troops returned to Vietnam, and by the end of the year, war had broken out. This conflict, known as the First Indochina War, lasted 8 bloody years. It was not just a nationalist war against colonialism. It was also the first major proxy conflict of the Cold War. The United States, fearing a communist victory, began funding France's war efforts. By the early 1950s, America was paying over 80% of France's military costs in Vietnam. In the countryside, the Viet Minh waged a guerrilla war, relying on local support, supply lines, and an unbreakable will. The French, though technologically superior, were unfamiliar with the terrain and failed to win hearts and minds. The turning point came in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu. In a stunning reversal, Viet Minh forces surrounded and annihilated a fortified French garrison, forcing France to sue for peace. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu shocked the world. At the Geneva Conference that followed, Vietnam's future was decided. It was agreed that Vietnam would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, the North under Ho Chi Minh's communist government, and the South under the pro-Western leadership of Emperor Bao Dai. Crucially, the Geneva Accords called for free nationwide elections in 1956 to reunite the country, but those elections never happened. With strong U.S. backing, Diem took power in the South and refused to hold the elections, aware that Ho Chi Minh would likely win. The United States, committed to containing communism, supported this move. Vietnam, once again, was split, and peace was short-lived. Diem, a staunch anti-communist and Catholic nationalist, declared himself president of the Republic of Vietnam in 1955. He was seen by the U.S. as a bulwark against communism in Southeast Asia, but his rule was deeply unpopular. Diem's government was corrupt, authoritarian, and disconnected from the largely Buddhist rural population. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong, a communist-led insurgency in the South, began to take shape. By 1963, Diem's regime was crumbling. In May, a crisis erupted when government troops opened fire on Buddhist protesters. The backlash was severe, and the most shocking moment came when a Buddhist monk, Thich Quang Duc, publicly set himself on fire in protest. Later that year, the United States withdrew its support for Diem. In November, he was overthrown and assassinated in a military coup, approved by the Kennedy administration. By 1963, Vietnam was in crisis. The North was determined to unify the country under communism. The South was politically unstable and increasingly reliant on American support. The Vietnam War, as most Americans would come to know it, with hundreds of thousands of troops, was about to begin.